Hey everyone, I'm Paul, and today I'm replacing the upper and lower ball joints in the front of this 1998 Toyota Tacoma, and while I'm in there, I'm also replacing the outer tie rod ends and sway bar links. This truck came to me on a trailer, already partially disassembled. How convenient! I'm replacing ball joints on both sides of the truck, but we're focusing on the left side for the video. The other side is the same. Let's get the wheel out of the way. Using a wrench and a sledgehammer is a great alternative to pulling super hard with your hands, then busting your knuckles when the bolt finally breaks loose. Let's get these caliper bolts out of the way. Insert a flathead screwdriver here and pry towards the outside. This will loosen up the caliper on the rotor, making it easy to remove. Hang the caliper with some rope or wire so it's not pulling on the rubber brake hose, then take the brake pads out. These pads are bad. There's a bit of rust everywhere, so I'm using PB Blaster to help break bolts loose. I don't have a wrench big enough for the tie rod end nut, so it's vice grip size. Again, I'm using the sledgehammer trick to break it loose. I need to turn the tie rod to unscrew it, but my wrench doesn't fit right because of the rust. Okay, that's better. In this truck, the tie rod end is pressed into the same piece as the lower ball joint. I'm replacing both parts, so I can just leave them together. The upper ball joint has a castle nut with a cotter pin going through it. Remove the nut, then use a ball joint separator tool. This tool is also called a pickle fork. Wedge it into the ball joint and hit it really hard with the sledgehammer. The tool is tapered, so it will push the ball joint away from the spindle. Notice I destroyed the rubber boot. Ball joints are not reusable. If you have to disconnect it, you also have to replace it. The upper ball joint assembly is held into the upper control arm with 4 bolts. It's a little stuck in here, but nothing the sledgehammer can't fix. While I'm in here, I might as well replace the sway bar links. They're easy to reach and it's not much extra work. If this part was new, the bolt would just slide out, but everything is rusted together. The block of wood is to hold the sway bar from moving while I cut the sway bar link with my saw. An angle grinder would work fine here too. Don't torment yourself with rusty bolts. Just cut them. I'm putting some pressure on the lower control arm with the jack so it doesn't move. This nut got ground down because the ball joint broke while the truck was driving and it ended up rubbing on the ground when the wheel moved away and stopped supporting the weight of the truck. The ball joint separator isn't working here because with a broken ball joint, it doesn't have the spindle to press against. I'll have to try something else. Let's get all the rubber out of here first. Then support the control arm again so it doesn't move around. And it's time for the torch. This would be smelling really bad right now if the rubber boot was still here. What is Paul's favorite tool for things that are rusty? I don't know, is it perhaps a big hammer? Don't be afraid to hit this stuff hard. These parts are designed to support a truck going down the road. A little bit of hammering isn't going to hurt it. This video isn't about brakes, but I would be silly not to throw some new pads in here while I have the spindle off the truck. This piece is called the caliper mount. Use a wire wheel to clean up the rust behind the little metal clip thingies. These little clips prevent the brake pads from rattling around. Removing the rust helps maintain the correct clearance so the new pads don't get stuck and wear unevenly. Push the brake piston all the way back in with a C-clamp and make sure the rubber dust seal isn't torn and isn't sticking up past the piston unevenly. This truck belongs to a client who does landscaping, so fixing it was a bit of an emergency. He can't work if the truck is broken. He went to Napa Auto Parts to pick up his ball joints and had a horrible time. The incompetent employees interfered with his ability to get the parts that he needs. At first, he brought me 1 ball joint that fits and 3 that don't. I sent him back to the store with the old parts from the truck and told him to push the dude aside and look up the parts on the computer himself. He still had to visit several stores and after a couple hours of a wild goose chase, came back with all the correct parts except for 1 ball joint that almost fit. I was able to grind it down a bit and make it work. So, I will not be including aftermarket part numbers for the ball joints. The parts store sway bar links were fine. It's always better to buy original Toyota parts. I know for a fact these ball joints worked for 23 years and 200,000 miles. Will the aftermarket parts last that long? Probably not. Toyota ball joints come pre-greased and don't have grease zerks. The aftermarket parts have them, so you can have all the fun of using a grease gun, none of which ever work correctly, and have to re-grease a bunch of parts periodically in your truck to maintain it now. Add some grease to the tapered part of the ball joint and tie rod so they don't seize, and add some Loctite to the bolts so they don't get loose and fall out. I'm getting these bolts kinda tight with the impact driver, and I'll torque them by hand later. Okay, the lower ball joint and tie rod end are ready to go back in the truck. The upper ball joint slides into the control arm with a tiny bit of help from the hammer. Loctite the bolts and install the nuts. This impact driver doesn't go super tight, so the final torquing should be done by hand. I'm not a big fan of using torque wrenches on stuff, but I'll include the specs for you on the screen. I actually recommend buying an aftermarket sway bar link because Toyota sells each little part separately, and it's annoying. It's just a bolt with some washers and rubber bushings. Put a bunch of grease on it so it doesn't get rusty. Lift the control arm up to get the sway bar link into position. Add some Loctite to the threads and tighten the nut until the rubber pieces start to compress, but don't go crazy with it. You don't want to destroy the rubber by flattening it. Tighten it just enough so it isn't loose. Now the spindle is ready to go back in. Drop the lower ball joint into the hole, then lift up the control arm as much as you can until the truck starts to lift. Gently push the upper control arm down and guide the threaded part of the ball joint into its hole. Thread the castle nut on. Tighten the lower ball joint nut as much as you can with the electric impact driver, not the air impact, and get the upper ball joint pretty tight too. I'll torque these later. Thread the steering rack into the tie rod end. I didn't turn the nut when taking it apart, so the alignment should be pretty close to where it was. That doesn't mean you can skip the alignment. Anytime you replace suspension components, the alignment angles can change, especially if you're using aftermarket parts that can be slightly different from the originals. Instead of using a torque wrench, I got the castle nut almost as tight as I can, then turned it a little more until the hole lined up with a slot and I could install the cotter pin. Bend the cotter pin enough that it won't fall out. I like to get it tight up against the nut so it doesn't rattle. The lower ball joint castle nut goes very tight. I also tightened this one, then went a bit more until I could install the cotter pin. The Napa Auto Parts Store ball joints come with this weird cotter pin that locks into place. I kinda like it. Tighten the upper ball joint, find the hole for the cotter pin, then turn it more until the hole lines up with a slot in the castle nut. Install the cotter pin. The lower ball joint is attached to the spindle with 2 big bolts. These go pretty tight too. Fill all the new ball joints and tie rod ends with the grease gun until you see the boots starting to bulge. My grease gun doesn't work, so I'll ask the guys at the alignment shop to grease these and hope they actually do it. The caliper mount goes back on next. Add some Loctite to these bolts. Always start bolts by hand so you don't cross-thread them. These bolts get torqued to 80 foot-pounds. It's the same spec as the wheel lug nuts. Install the brake pads into the caliper bracket. They should fit tightly into the little metal anti-vibration clips. Make sure to add some grease into the caliper slider pins. This is a floating caliper. That means the piston pushes on one side and the caliper has to move to apply pressure to both brake pads. Rusty caliper sliders will cause uneven brake pad wear and make your brakes weak. This video isn't about brakes, but the next step is to bleed the brakes at all 4 wheels. When the brake pads wear out, your brake fluid also wears out. Buy a big 32-ounce bottle of .3 or .4 fluid and run all of it through the system. Before driving the truck, make sure to push the brake pedal down a few times until the piston pushes against the pads and the brakes actually work. Finally, install the wheels and torque the lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. I always use a torque wrench for lug nuts. Don't do this with an air impact wrench. Now that I've rebuilt the front suspension on this truck, the next thing to do is take it to the shop for an alignment. Thanks for watching, and remember to check out my other car repair videos.